Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us today. My name's Hannah Booth and I'm the Communications Manager here at Morepay. It's my pleasure to introduce to you for today, which is dignity at work. This afternoon, Michelle will go above and beyond the standard questions around workplace discrimination, exploring the legal framework, biases to consider and how it impacts recruitment, retention and employee satisfaction. So having a quick look at the agenda for this afternoon, Michelle will start off by exploring what dignity at work is and will also run through the legal framework. She'll then discuss behaviours that can be classified as appropriate versus inappropriate and how to deal with concerns around dignity at work when they're raised. Finally, Michelle will talk through the importance of having an inclusive culture. A few things to run through as well before we do begin. So after the main presentation, we'll move into the Q&A section of the webinar. You may have noticed your microphone is on mute, but we do still want to hear from you. So please drop your questions into the question panel as shown here. We've had an incredible response to this webinar, so I imagine that we will receive lots of questions, but we'll do our best to get through as many of them as we can. Also, if you are facing technical difficulties, don't worry too much. We will send you all a recording of the webinar and also a copy of the slides. However, if you are facing technical difficulties, please do flag it in the question panel, because if lots of them come flooding through, I'll know there's a problem at our end and I can do my best to fix it. I realise there will be some people on the webinar this afternoon that aren't familiar with Morepay, so I'll give a very brief introduction. We provide payroll and HR software as well as outsourcing services to UK businesses. We've been around since 1966, have all the accreditations you'd expect, and we're rated excellent on Trustpilot. Our promise is to make payroll and HR easy, and this is how we do it. We've built payroll and HR software that's easy. We deliver quality outsourcing options, and all of this means worry-free compliance for our businesses that we help. So for people that have joined our webinars before, then you'll be familiar with Michelle. Michelle's our HR Services Director and she's been with Morepay since 2017. She's CIPD qualified with over 18 years of both operational and strategic HR experience. So I'll now hand you over to Michelle, who will take you through today's session on dignity at work. Thanks, Michelle.
Thank you so much, Hannah. So on to the topic of dignity at work. This is a huge topic and one that we certainly aren't going to cover in any great detail over the next sort of half an hour, 45 minutes. But I want to give you a flavour of what we've been dealing with around dignity at work at Morepay. In the HR services team, we have seen quite a flurry and an increase in customers contacting us with dignity at work questions. And for those of you who've attended webinars before, you might know that we did a specific webinar on sexual harassment, which was a topic that we were seeing increasingly coming into our advice line. And we're looking at ways that we can proactively help our customers and anybody else who's joined this webinar deal with these issues. And we've broadened it out to talk about dignity at work. But if I could summarise it in a clear way, it's about three areas. It's around respecting people's values, contributions and differences. It's about creating an environment that encourages acceptance. And this may seem really obvious, but it's something that you need to keep repeating and ensuring is followed through. It's about ensuring the workplaces, both physical or virtual, are free from bullying and harassment. And I think the CIPD sum it up really well when they say that people have the right to be treated with respect and dignity at work. I think we've made a lot of progress over the years. You know, if you kind of think back to many years ago and even recent films that have come out like The Wolf of Wall Street, and you think about probably the lack of dignity at work that happened in its extremity in those kind of circumstances, we have moved on in the world. People are talking more about this. It is on people's agenda, but there is still lots to do, and that is the reason that we're going to keep talking about it. So moving on to the next slide then. Apologies, just while the technology catches up. I just want to start by talking around the legal framework and make sure that for particularly all the HR professionals that are on this call, but for interest of anybody else on the call, that we kind of put it in the right legal framework. And the two areas that you're looking at in terms of legalities and employment law with dignity at work is around harassment and bullying. And harassment by law is subjecting someone to unwanted conduct, which is either related to a relevant protected characteristic, so this is something like race, sex, or it could be of a sexual nature, and where the conduct has the purpose or effect of violating the victim's dignity or creating an environment that's intimidating, hostile, degrading, or humiliating. It's also worth noting that harassment could just be one incident. It doesn't have to be a series of incidents. If the incident is serious enough of its nature, it could just be one issue that's brought to your attention. And then bullying, according to ACAS, is unwanted behaviour from a person or group that either is offensive, intimidating, malicious, or insulting, or is an abuse or misuse of power that undermines, humiliates, or causes physical or emotional harm to someone. And I just think with these 2 points, it's really worth bearing them in mind as we go through the rest of the presentation. So when talking about dignity at work, the big area that I like to focus on is talking about appropriate behaviour and really looking at what the fine line is between office banter, making your workplace a fun place to be. We all have to spend a lot of time at work, and we also, as business owners, HR professionals, talk about how to make the place of work a fun place, a good place, a place people want to be in, talking about employee engagement and welfare. But how do you keep that fine line between that fun place to work or crossing over to where there is inappropriate behaviour? Where does office banter turn into something that is inappropriate? Now, being totally honest, we are living in a world now where people do speak up about things that they find difficult. They also speak up about things that they find offensive. And there's kind of a thought that maybe you can't say anything at work because people are just going to get offended. That's not necessarily the case, but I think it's a really important topic to talk about in terms of appropriate behaviour. Now, I can't give you a list of what is and is not inappropriate. There are some really obvious things that are inappropriate, but there is no way that anybody could have a definitive list and hand it to their employees to say this is exactly what you can and can't do or can and can't say. I do remember many, many years ago when I started my career, I worked for a company who was owned by a larger American organisation, and they actually sent out a fairly hefty document trying to say what was appropriate workwear and what wasn't, but it actually just ended up turning into a big joke because they hadn't covered everything, and there was different opinions even of the pictures they put in. So I'm not suggesting anybody starts to do a full list, but you need to start thinking about what is and isn't appropriate behaviour and how you communicate that to your employees in terms of standards of behaviour. So the first thing then is thinking about the culture. How do you ensure that you keep the good parts of the culture that are there, the parts that people enjoy, keeping work as fun as it possibly can be, but reducing the potential for offence or complaints? Now, cultures are built over a long time, and there are many aspects that fall into it. But that is something that look at how your culture is, look at how your managers behave, look at how your senior leaders behave. Is that trickled down through the organisation? Are the behaviours that you would like to encourage or ones that you would like to discourage? Look at how that culture is built. Also look at creating sort of working parties or working groups within that culture to look at how you can encourage inclusive behaviour, and getting that right at the grassroots stuff will just make a really big difference. I think one of the things that I would really push and for you to take away from this webinar, because we are going to give lots of information, but is around education to employees. It really is key to making this work, talking about it with employees and facing into the issues, and some of them are difficult topics to have, but educating employees, whether that is through the policies that you've got, working groups, or whether it is doing training with the whole of your organisation. I've worked in organisations where we have actually done dignity at work training, and that has been right through the organisation. And we've talked about some really tough topics, but just getting it out there, getting people to think about it, to talk about it, has really made a difference. And one of the areas in particular that can really work from education and training is about discussing perception and helping people understand that whilst we don't want to go to the extremes of don't say anything because you might offend somebody, it's just about having that balanced understanding that the offence of something lies in the eye of the beholder, and that just because there was a lack of intent or I didn't mean it to sound like that, doesn't stop it being an issue. A lot of the time, these sorts of things can be resolved informally. If somebody says, look, I really don't like how you said that, or I really don't like what you said, just by the other person simply understanding that their perception is different to the other person's, and perhaps just saying, oh, I'm sorry, I didn't realise that, and creating a culture where that is okay, that may make a massive difference. Again, I've used training techniques previously, and we've actually done this in Morpay with some of our customers. There's some really good exercises that you can use to bring this to light and to allow your employees to have this discussion, and for managers to understand what part they play. So examples are showing videos of scenarios where somebody says something and it's a potentially offensive conversation, and allowing the group to discuss, what do you think about that? How would you react to that? Is there something you would do? What if somebody complained? And starting to have those conversations. There's also the opportunity to, I've done it where I've literally had a list of comments that may be offensive. I've read them all out to the group that it was training, and asked them to raise a red card if they found that offensive, or a green card if they didn't, and then again just get the group to discuss it themselves. It's such a powerful tool to get people to just open their eyes and understand that everyone views the world in a different way, and it actually goes a long way to creating quite a harmonious workforce. And I guess this all loops around then into talking about communication. It is just regular communications about acceptable standards of behaviour, reminding people, talking about it, allowing people to be open, allowing people to be themselves, but making sure that this issue is faced head on. So moving on to the next part then. There's lots of things that you can do to be proactive. I've just talked about a couple, and I will come on to some more shortly. But the fact of the matter is that you still may have to deal with concerns that are raised, and you need to make sure that these are dealt with in the proper way, that are dealt with according to the ACAS Code of Practice and within the legal framework that we've already touched on. And most importantly, that all employees in the organisation know how they will be dealt with, and know that their complaints will be taken seriously. So some of the things on here are suggestions of what you need in place to actually deal with concerns. You need to make sure that you have a policy and process in place for people, for employees to be able to raise their concerns, whether that's in addition to your normal grievance procedure or whether you have something that's called out separately. There may be a hotline, a whistleblowing hotline that you want to put in place so people can report things confidentially. But just make sure that you've got the right policies and procedures in place for reporting, but also what's going to happen next, what happens when a complaint comes in, and everybody should know in advance what that looks like. Make sure that when a complaint does come in, that they're thoroughly investigated, that you involve the right people. So whether it's your own internal HR team, it's dealing with the Morpay HR advice line, or the solicitors that we have in the organisation, make sure the matters are thoroughly investigated. Even if you have a thought at the beginning of what is right or wrong, it's the same as any employment law matter. You need to thoroughly investigate and show the investigation that's taken place. It's really important to act immediately. Don't let the grass grow under your feet when these things come in. Act straight away. Make sure that the process is put in place and you're thoroughly investigating it. Whilst you're investigating, though, probably one thing to call out is looking at whether it's formal versus informal. There are certain complaints that may be raised that absolutely have to go formal, and unfortunately we have seen some of these very serious ones happen with our customers, then the calls that come into the advice centre have to go formal straight away. But there may be an incident where it is a misunderstanding and it could be solved down informal route. So look at that option first. Make sure that both parties are protected. There can be a temptation to immediately jump to protect just the person who has made the complaint, but you've got to make sure that you've treated all parties fairly in it. If there is a serious incident, you think that between the two people they need to be separated in work, is it something that's potential gross misconduct and therefore you need to suspend, or is it just, even if it's not as serious as that, do you need to move the two people from a different team for now? There are things to look at, but again, always take advice when you're doing that. But you've got to look at both parties involved. And then once you've done all the investigations, just make sure that you communicate the outcome to both parties and explain the reasons why you came to the decision that you did. So moving on then, just to try and contextualise this a bit, we have pulled out a customer case study that we have had, obviously anonymising the customer, but this was a sexual harassment case in a hospitality setting. Now, the backstory to this was a waitress had a public Instagram account and had posted various pictures of her private social life, but it was a public page. And on that page was a picture of her in a bikini, and her manager liked the picture and made a comment underneath it. Now, whilst the comment wasn't necessarily inappropriate, it was probably unwise from a manager to make a comment on an employee. This led to a series of incidents that happened afterwards. It was raised, kind of dealt with a bit too informally, and thereafter, anything that the manager did that involved this employee, she took as consequences of her rejection towards his advances. So I think she'd asked for some leave, which was denied because there was somebody already off, or she got a very small reprimand for something she'd done on shift. She took those all as a consequence of her, as I said, rejecting his advances. The long story short is that she eventually raised a grievance and resigned, citing that she had been forced to leave because of the treatment that she'd received. And this case went to tribunal. It ended up being settled before tribunal because there were some gaps in the process that had been followed. And I think this was the big learning point for this customer from the case. And it's a really good illustration or a good story to show that, first of all, there's a real importance of keeping workplace relationships professional. Again, there are lines to be crossed. We all know that people do end up in actual consensual relationships that have happened at work, but especially between a manager and employee, there does need to be a line, and communicating, educating, training managers and employees alike helps to put that out there in the first place. It really also stresses the importance of the business taking the matter seriously, and I think this is where this case fell down quite early on. It wasn't taken as seriously as it should have been. I think hindsight's a great thing, but it might have been resolvable if there'd been more of an intervention at the beginning. I think it also showed that once the employee was offended by their colleague, or in this case manager's behaviour, that they just weren't ready to give them the benefit of the doubt for anything that happened in the future, especially because they felt it hadn't been dealt with appropriately. And again, just re-emphasising that the offence lies in the eye of the beholder, but there were certainly process areas that this business could have got better, which wouldn't have ended up in the same scenario, or if it had have ended up in the same scenario, it would have been much more defendable at a tribunal. So I think it may sound, again, really obvious, but with dignity at work, prevention is much better than cure, and building an inclusive culture really is the cornerstone to getting this right. Building an environment where people are respected, are included, their differences are celebrated, having that as the foundation and cornerstone of your organisation will lessen the chances of these things happening, but if they do happen, will put you in a much stronger position to deal with it. And I think that's the key. So these are some of the areas that I've pulled out that I think are important to think about when thinking about your culture and how do you prevent these things happening. I've already talked quite a little bit about policies and procedures and having those in place and review them regularly. Don't sit back on your laurels and think once a policy has been put in place, whether that is around dignity at work specifically or whether it's included in your discipline or grievance policy, and make sure that they're reviewed on a regular basis to make sure they're keeping up with everything they need to and that they're solid in case something does happen. Training is really, really important. I've already talked again a bit about this, but I think this is something that all businesses really should consider about how do you train out and educate your employees and your managers on behaviours, what's acceptable and how to deal with things if they happen, and in some cases being able to nip things in the bud. Make sure that as much as possible there is open and transparent communication throughout the organisation. Talk openly about this as a topic, demonstrate the display of behaviour that you would like to see in the organisation, and make sure senior leader managers follow this, but that they are open and honest when communicating about it. I think it's really important to seek feedback. So one of the areas to look at is your employee engagement surveys. Ask people really how they feel about working there. There'll be certain questions you're asking about their role, about the systems they use, about their work equipment, but also understand how they feel about working there. What is the culture like? And then maybe some specific questions you want to ask around dignity at work. Some organisations have gone as far as creating roles to look at these kind of areas. So there are larger businesses that have diversity directors to help really focus that organisation and making sure that they've got the most diverse workforce as possible. Or you might want to form some working groups, whether that's about a specific topic or more broader about dignity at work. You know, get the people in your organisation, the employees who are there day in, day out to help you build this culture, because they're going to buy into it a lot more if they've helped to create it. Look at removing biases from your processes, and this is looking right through all policies and processes, so right from recruitment and selection through to performance management, to around reward and recognition, which I'll talk about in a second. How can you remove especially unconscious biases from them so that it's not sort of swayed towards a particular demographic? How do you open this up to everybody? Really think about reward and recognition. There are loads of ways that you can reward and recognise employees now. It isn't just all about base salary. Look at the benefits that you've got on offer. Are they inclusive right across the group and right across different demographics? Look at extra things that you can do to reward employees, whether that's extra holidays. And then when you're thinking about recognising employees, make sure that the reward and recognition, particular recognition, happens right across the organisation. I think there can sometimes be a tendency to focus reward and recognitions on certain departments. So, for example, it's typical in a sales and marketing function that there are targets, that these targets are talked about, they're communicated. You might have leaderboards, you might have quarterly prizes for top salesperson. But think about all the other functions, especially the back office ones. Are they being included in reward and recognition? It might be in a different way. It might not be the same thing that motivates them, but make sure their work is called out. We in Morepay have an app that we use called My Appreciation. And that is a great way. It's kind of like a social media feed where anybody can go on and recognise another colleague, even just a thank you for helping me out today with that tough customer call I had. And that's a great way, and over time that really becomes part of your culture. I've said it already, but I will emphasise this point again about leading by example. Look at the senior leaders in your organisation, look at the diversity of your senior leaders, and then look at their behaviour. Are they demonstrating what you want the organisation to demonstrate? And then make sure that you put things in place to create a supportive environment where people feel valued and they feel that they can raise concerns, they can raise issues without fear of repercussion. and feel that they are supported not only in the work that they do now, but in their development going forward. And moving on. One of the areas that I just wanted to touch on very briefly is about using HR technology and how this can help with pulling all these things together, because I know I've talked about a lot of different areas, and what I was trying to do is kind of give you a bit of food for thought to take away, and then you can home in on the areas that you really want to focus on. And these are strategies for the longer term. There'll be short-term wins, but it is thinking about strategies for the longer term with dignity at work. But technology and HR software really can add benefit here. And the areas that it can help with is giving clarity of policy. So good HR technology can hold and distribute policy documents and ensure and enable that managers and employees have signed off that they've read the policy documents, that they've understood them, and that you've got a record to go back to say we communicated this and you all know about it. It's particularly important when an incident happens. From a process perspective, it's also important for employees to know that there is a clear and robust policy and process in place. And HR tech, intranet pages, they can help share that information and effective workflows to make sure that they are consistently applied. There's also the option for confidentiality. So employees may want to report something confidentiality, and if they could do that via their HR software or through kind of a ticketing system, this allows employees to potentially even circumvent their managers, because sometimes the issue might involve their managers, but there's an opportunity with tech to create that confidential line to an HR team, for example. But then the other thing it will also give you is, just in more general terms as well, is around reporting. It can produce some really meaningful reporting on every piece of data that you hold. So it could be the makeup of your organisation in terms of diversity, whether that is sex, whether it's sex, race, sexual orientation, whatever it is that you want to know about in the organisation. You can hold that information and report on what your organisation looks like and how that has differed over time. But it will also allow you to do things like the anonymous engagement surveys, where you might ask specific questions. You can also do specific surveys to ask about dignity at work to see if there is a problem and what people think about it. And then even down to basic things like exit interviews. If you can hold that information on a system, you can start to look at trends and analysis from exit interviews. There's just a wealth of data that's held in HR software, and I think that it's really powerful when you're talking about building your culture and looking at an area like dignity at work.
So we'll now move into the Q&A session. So please do drop any questions that you may have into the question panel. I know that we have gone through a lot of information, so it may be that questions don't come to you straight away. But like I say, do drop your questions into the question panel and we will run through them. So the first question that we've received: how can you understand how employees feel about how we as an organisation handle dignity at work?
Really good question. I think I'll loop back to what I've talked about with engagement surveys. I think it's really important to understand specifically how employees feel about dignity at work, and even calling it out as a specific question. So I'll give you an example that we do in our own company. So for More Pay, when we have our engagement survey, one of our questions is on a scale of 0 to 10. If I experience serious misconduct at work, how confident am I that this would be dealt with? And I think that is a great question, and it's asking people even before something has happened. And you can really get a feel for the organisation of how people feel about sort of the trust they've got in the organisation. And that kind of score, you'll get extremes, but you'll be able to then do something about it in advance and not wait till it's a problem. So I think doing something through an engagement survey would be a really good idea there.
Thanks, Michelle. And we've also received a follow-on question from that. So how do you manage perception with such a mixed workforce in terms of age and also difference in that perception?
Yeah, I think there is only so much you can do when you're talking about perception, and you will, even just like you said, by age, but also by other demographics, you will find that there are real extremities of people's views. I think what you've got to do is encourage that open and honest communication amongst all the demographics. So, for example, the training that I was talking about, where you could show a scenario and ask people to give their views, it's having someone facilitate that discussion can be quite tricky, because you might have people who are very opinionated about it one way or the other. But I found that they're really powerful, powerful exercises, and even people with strong views can come out of those thinking, okay, I hadn't quite looked at it from that perspective before. The thing that I just mostly say is, though, just keep doing it and keep talking about it. You're not going to tick every box. You're not going to please everybody. You're not going to get everybody to change their views to have the same view, and that's not what you're trying to do. It's just getting people to understand that, yes, I may have that view, but sometimes I just need to step back and appreciate that isn't the same as somebody else's, and we can all still move on and do our jobs and have kind of the right vibe in the workplace. But it's just really important to face into it and talk about it.
Thanks, Michelle. And next question. I work in a very male-dominated environment, and trying to get them to not act in hostile and sometimes aggressive manners can be highly difficult. How would you suggest starting this process off?
Yeah, that's a very, very good question. And I, very early on in my career, worked in a very male-dominated environment, so understand exactly how that feels. I think this is something that needs to be tackled head on. It needs to be tackled from the top down. So the senior leaders and the managers in the organisation need to be very clear about what is and is not appropriate behaviour, particularly around where you sort of mentioned perhaps things like aggression. I think that the clarity needs to come from the behaviour of the top. It needs to be supported by policies, by training, but also by taking action where things do cross the line. I think that then starts to send the message to the organisation and to the people who may be behaving like that this isn't acceptable and it will be dealt with. It isn't going to change overnight, but it's about being consistent with how you apply that. But there are lots of kind of proactive and preventative measures that you can put in place to start to change that. But that is an excellent question. Yeah.
Thank you, Michelle. Moving on to the question. Is there anything specific you would recommend for the Christmas party season?
Yeah, I have actually done a webinar previously on Christmas parties, which I imagine is still on the MorePay website if anyone wants to look at it. I know we're kind of already into Christmas party season now, being halfway through December, but I think it's making sure that prior to Christmas parties, the biggest thing people need to understand is that if Christmas parties are being organised, particularly if they're being organised by the business, that it is an extension of the workplace, and that if there is situations that happen which potentially violate somebody's dignity, that can be classed as a work issue. It can even be that after parties, or ones that haven't been organised by work, end up in the same category because it's less clear there. But the biggest thing you can do if you're organising a works Christmas party is just reiterate that the standards of behaviour that you expect at work is extended to that party. And if there is anything that comes out of it or any complaints, that they are dealt with in the same way. Again, it's a difficult one because you want people to switch off a bit, to have fun, to relax, to celebrate what they've achieved in the year, but it still has to be done with dignity, and people need to understand that. But I can say, from working in HR over many years and for different organisations, I have had the dread of a Monday morning thinking what has happened over the weekend at a Christmas party that I need to deal with. It's not a fun position to be in, especially when you throw in things like alcohol. So biggest thing is just making sure that expectations are laid out at the beginning.
you, Michelle. So we'll just move on to the last question now. How do you deal with comments that have no intent when made in a different language, but are still generally inappropriate? So I guess that's maybe looking at kind of language barriers, maybe things that maybe some cultures, maybe not in others, that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah, I completely understand this. And again, it is a very good question. And we have had instances from our customers at MorePay where this has happened, where, say, for example, a very common phrase in England that's used quite regularly could be being completely misinterpreted by somebody where English isn't their first language. I think even if the intent wasn't there, and it is just a common phrase, I'm trying to think of the example off the top of my head, but it's not coming to me, because we have had one not so long ago. But regardless of that, I would say that you still need to take it seriously. The worst thing you could do is brush it off informally and say to the person who's made the complaint, oh, it's not an issue, because that's just a saying we say in England. I'm using that as an example, that we say, you know, not taking them seriously. Still take it seriously, look into it, see if it can be dealt with informally, bring the parties together, maybe try and have some kind of mediation session where that is explained, but just make sure you tackle it head on, and don't fall into the trap of thinking, well, because it wasn't meant that way. I mean, it can happen vice versa. Yeah, just don't fall into that trap, make sure it's dealt with.
Thank you, Michelle. We have also had some questions around whether we have any training materials for line managers, which is an interesting one because it is actually an area that we will be looking at in the new year. We are looking at doing certainly a webinar on your line managers, which does link in quite nicely with that. So look out for the emails in the new year, but it is something that we have definitely got planned, I think, for February.
Yeah,
and we will share the details of that with you.
Yeah, I would also say, though, that if we've got any customers or even prospects on here who are looking at specific training that they would like for their organisation, that is something that our consultancy team can and have picked up in the past. So they've worked with the organisation to look at the areas that we need to particularly focus on and put together like dignity at work training to help managers deal with issues both proactively and reactively. And we've got quite a lot of material. So some of the training exercises that I talked about before, we've actually used with our customers, and it's worked really, really well. So if there are any customers or even prospects who are interested, please do get in touch, and we can look at what we can do in addition to the other things that we're going to be putting out there in the new year.
Thank you, Michelle. So that does bring us to the end of the webinar this afternoon. I do hope you found it all useful, and thank you to Michelle as always for a fantastic presentation. We will follow up with a recording and also a copy of the slides so that you've got that to refer back to. So yes, thank you very much for joining the webinar, and hopefully we will see you at another webinar in the new year. Thanks everyone.